You wake to the rasp of seal wax and the smell of lamp oil. 3 doors standing like questions along a stone corridor, one ajar, one bolted, one only whispered about. A woman named Catherine lies on a slab between them, her hands bound with coarse string that has already cut a pale rim into her wrists. She hears voices beyond the doors, and in the space beneath the lids she imagines the ledger that will take her name. Catherine is 22. Her father is dead. Her mother vanished in the uproar that carried her across the border into the hands of men who count people the way merchants count sacks of grain. If this story matters to you, stay with it. Subscribe and like so the names of those who passed through such systems are not lost. Catherine remembered a market at first, figs stacked like small moons, the cracked blue of a glazed bowl. Her father bargaining in halting Arabic while she read aloud a line from a prayer in her own tongue. Memory flared in spare images, because the rest, the day the caravans came, the shouting, the closing of doors, had been tumbled into a single shape of absence. She could say, now, that she had been taken in the spring of 1260, the year that rearranged borders and the fortunes of those who lived at them. That year was a hinge. Soldiers pushed through towns, houses emptied, and the institutions that processed human lives took particular practice in ordering what they took. There was, already, an order to it. The Mamluk processing system did not operate only by blunt force, it operated by procedure. Men with neat, ink-stained fingers kept ledgers. Stewards were the habit of neutrality, and administrative calm that functioned as consent. The system moved like a careful hand. Capture, delivery to a regional cage, inventory, selection, training, placement. Each stage had names recorded on wax tablets sealed with a stamp that translated into power. To be named and sealed was not merely recognition, it was classification. The seal, when it stuck, interrupted the life you had been living and placed you into another papered life. They brought Catherine to the chamber beneath where the city's caravans came to unload. The processing chamber smelled of damp stone and oil and something like old bread. 3 doors opened from the chamber into 3 different procedures, one to interrogation and assessment, one to temporary lodging for those awaiting sale, one to the rooms where the household instructors took the new arrivals for what they called integration. The doors were more than architecture. They were the grammar of fate. An official with a small knife used for trimming wax tablets unrolled his instructions and glanced at her with the same attention one gives a ledger number. He was called Amir Tashamor in the records, an administrator with a reputation for precision. He asked her name. Her name, she provided, in the language that clung to her like an undergarment. He wrote it down, translated it into the record language, and then wrote another name beside it, an identifier that suited the system's appetite for categories. Christian foreigner, literate, female, age 22. The translation of certain titles appears in the records as a phrase that modern hands have rendered as integration specialist, a man whose role in practice was to determine whether a person would be trained as a servant, a concubine, a soldier, a domestic instructor, or retained for distant household. The titles were ways to make moral ambiguity administrative. They interrogated her with small practical questions and with a few that were careful tests. What languages did she speak? Could she sew? Could she read a wax tablet? Did she know to carry herself with deference? The tests were not always disguised as tests. A lantern was tilted so she might read a line of script by its light. A trainer watched how her fingers folded a piece of cloth. Catherine answered and performed what she could. Performance mattered, in that room, more than truth. The system needed certain things. It needed predictability, people who could be counted on to perform labor, to accept the schedules of a household, to meet expectations of discretion. It required adaptation, the erasure of names and the substitution of function. It rewarded those who learned quickly with small mercies, more bread, a cleaner mat, the responsibility of reading aloud to a child in the household, and punished by bureaucratic means those who did not fit the narrow definitions. The ledger recorded productivity and mortality in the same column, a judgment that reduced lives to yield. Catherine's selection followed the quiet arithmetic she had witnessed on markets, one more weighed sack among many. A trainer called Sophia was appointed to her by way of introduction, a woman whose face had the measured patience of someone who had been through the same conveyor and, in many ways, had become its instrument. Sophia's hand was steady when she adjusted the cord at Catherine's wrist. "Learn the rules," she said once, as if instructing on the folding of a shirt, or learn the cost of forgetting them. Training began the next day and proceeded with an efficiency that had been codified into weekly rhythms. For 8 weeks they measured bodies, voices, and patience, each week a small ordered program. Week 1, language and posture. Catherine was made to repeat phrases in the record language until the syllables did not reveal where she had come from. They corrected the tilt of her chin and the cadence of her speech, so that she would offend less and obey more. They taught the phrases people wanted to hear and the silences that meant acquiescence. Week 2, body memory. Her movements were reshaped. How to carry a platter without clatter. How to lace a robe, with white hands that did not tremble. They taught her to move like the household expected. Economy of motion as evidence of efficiency. Week 3, household management. She learned ledgers, a different sort of towers, the allocation of oil and water, the names of the spices, and which rooms required more sweeping at dusk. Instruction came from older women whose hands moved like accountants. "Keep a small ledger in your head," Sophia said. "Remember who takes what." Week 4, forward-facing expectation. She practiced courtesies before the household's male members, how to lower her eyes, how to answer a command without adding the weight of protest. They rehearsed the social choreography that would make her invisible in ways the household preferred. Week 5, night duties and boundaries. They gave them the terms to refer to certain functions that were expected at night, terms the ledger would later render as assigned duties or private service. Trainers emphasized that the household's privacy had to be protected, that whispering of what went on below the candles would only harm the household and, by their argument, the household's dependents. Week 6, record work. Catherine learned how to incise pigment into wax and press the seal. She copied sample entries into tablets that would become her handwriting in the archives. Received, bread, dispensed, wool, noted, absences. The act of inscribing was itself a lesson in obedience. If one could write the ledger's language, one could be trusted to follow its logic. Week 7, instructional labor. She began to be placed in roles where she taught newly arrived younger women how to fold cloth, how to carry water, thus becoming an instrument in the replication of the system. The trainers called this stabilization. It required both distance and a practical cruelty. To teach a technique of submission is to teach the system how to survive. Week 8, assessment and placement. Officials reviewed the wax tablets and the seals again. An entry was made that precise hands folded and sealed. Catherine, literate, competent in household management, suitable for placement within an amir's domestic retinue with potential for later manumission after extended faithful service. The training was organized so that the individual did not always experience it as a singular trauma, but as a series of small corrections and rewards. Each correction was accompanied by the soft authority of expertise. "Say it this way," a trainer would instruct, and the new phrasing slid like a bandage over the old name. The competitive logic of the system meant some survived it with minor allowances, others were assigned to more exposed positions, and their mortality, already tall in the accounts, was read as attrition in the margins. Once placed in Amir Kalawan's household, Catherine learned that the domestic world was itself another kind of institution, with hierarchies carved into rooms and beds. Kalawan was a man whose household was known for its order and its strict measurement of service. The house that carpets laid heavy to absorb sound, alcoves for those who wished to speak in private, and a steward who kept a ledger thicker than any Catherine had seen.
The steward, a broad-shouldered man with ink always dark on his fingers, kept an internal ledger that recorded not only bread and oil, but who had performed the night duties, and which ones were considered gifted and which assigned. Catherine's days became a cadence of tasks, bringing in water, teaching children to read the basic syllables, mending garments, dusting the polished mirror that rested in a niche where she would sometimes catch a glimpse of herself. The mirror grew to be a small altar of recognition and alienation. Some mornings, those rare mornings when the house allowed a few sunlight threads, she would look at the oval glass and try on the face of the woman she had been. Most days, she learned to fold that memory away as if it were a shawl that would catch dust if left exposed. At night, the assigned duties came by arrangement rather than immediate demand. She was told, in the language of the household, that certain nights required closed doors and silence in the corridors. The phraseology of those orders is dry when read in the ledgers: night duty executed, household privacy observed. In speech, the words came out as softer directives, and in practice, as an enforced intimacy that the state and the household both profited from, measured in stability and sometimes in the patron's favor. There were no explicit lines drawn in the records for the harm done. The harm was a category that slid into other columns: sickness, absences, disobedience. Years condensed into entries. In 1279, the city outside the household walls bristled with new edicts. In the household, Catherine was promoted to a position where she oversaw the younger women's instruction. Her hand had memorized the ledger's script. She knew how to press wax that would not crumble, how to melt a seal without leaving irregular marks. These skills were small currencies. The steward would sometimes hand her a dirham as a discreet thank you for a job well done. She kept them hidden in the seam of a mattress. The dirhams did not buy autonomy. They purchased moments of small dignity, a warm bowl or a chance to buy oil for her own skin. The moral cost of such survival accrued quietly. Catherine saw in the faces of novices the same shadow she carried: a soft, divided attention that kept them present enough to be useful, but not so present that they might act on their own. She found herself teaching a girl named Zara how to knot a robe so it would not slip during the household's busiest hours. Zara's hands were small and quick. She had the ease of youth. Yet Zara would later become an instrument of the system in ways Catherine could not afford to be, offering herself to patrons when a steward's ledger called for stability improvement. On evenings when the household settled, Catherine could hear Zara's muffled cries in a private room and tell herself that sound had a way of being recorded not in ink but in muscle memory. That was the essential function of the household.
It reproduced its own forms. Survivors taught newcomers to survive by means that were legible to the ledger. In doing so, some survivors became agents of the system, complicit in its perpetuation, not because they had a desire to dominate, but because the options were counted and narrow. Catherine lived with the knowledge of her own complicity as one might live with a scar, understood an index of survival, and yet also a reminder of cost. In 1284, a new emir rose in influence, and the household felt political pressure as it reshuffled its internal distinctions. A qadi came to review certain records, the sort of review that placed men in positions of measurable accountability. Records were brought forth: wax tablets, seals, lists of service. The reviewing officials announced that those who had served faithfully for a given span could petition for a release, a manumission that would be recorded as law. Manumission, in the statutes, was not a full reclamation of life. It was a legal status that unbound someone from the immediate ownership of a house. It carried with it obligations and often maintained social enmeshment. Freedom in paper that sometimes left social dependencies intact. But it was a recognized pathway. The existence of the pathway became a focal point in households where older servants had served decades. Catherine began to measure her years in a way the ledger encouraged. She kept a private tablet and in careful strokes recorded dates. The day she first read a household order aloud. The day she was given the small dirham. The day the qadi announced the possibility of petition. Recording dates was a double act. It was both a way to keep the ledger's logic internal and a way to remember the self that the ledger sought to replace.
The wax tablet in her bedchamber held the secret of her intention, and the seal she had pressed into practice now became a symbol she longed to invert, to press for freedom rather than for submission. She rehearsed her petition as one rehearses a prayer. Her voice bent the phrases into the language of jurisdiction. "Honored Kadi," she practiced under her breath, feeling the syllables move as if they were ritual knots. "I petition for the recognition of manumission on grounds of extended faithful service and contribution to household maintenance and instructive labor." The language was precise and legalistic because the system answered to its own phrases. To petition properly, one must speak the ledger's grammar. She did not rehearse for shame aloud. Shame, in private, was an internal ledger of another sort, a column in which she counted nights she had been forced into intimacy, recorded only as night duty. Instead, she practiced the measured respirations that kept her voice even, the small gestures of deference that would not be mistaken for entreaty. She practiced in front of the mirror, the same oval that had once been a place for recognizing her old face. Now the mirror taught her to flatten the edges of her expression into a countenance that would be legible to the tribunal. Sophia, when she saw Catherine practicing, said nothing. Sophia's silence itself was a counsel, a historical knowledge of the costs of raising hope too openly. The archives would later show that those who petitioned had to endure reviews. The Kadi read the wax tablets. The steward testified regarding the petitioner's service record. Seals were examined to ensure there was no tampering. The legal procedures were formal and public, and the silence between the petitioner's speech and the Kadi's ruling was where entire lives could be contained or denied. The ritualized quiet was a kind of crucible. It allowed the public to witness the legal mechanics of mercy or indifference. Catherine's petition, when she finally decided to lay it down on the steward's desk, was as much a public act as a private assertion. She wrote the petition by the light of a lamp in a small hand pressed to a wax tablet. Date, service years, contributions itemized. She included, in the margin, a note about her literacy and her role instructing novices, evidence that she had become necessary to the household's operations. The steward looked at the tablet, ran his thumb over the wax as if checking for authenticity, and then handed it to a man with a clean seal. "In the records," he said finally, "you have performed. The Kadi will review." It was not the rhetorical flourish of a courtroom drama. It was a procedural movement along the chain. The tablet would be docketed. The steward would enter its number in the ledger. Then the slow machinery of paperwork would grind on. Letters dispatched to the Kadi's office, a date set for audience, seals prepared. In the meantime, Catherine returned to her duties. She continued to teach, to write, to press seal into wax, each action now double-edged, a means of income and an exercise in demonstrating usefulness. There were small reversals, instances where she used her position to shield a younger woman from the most exposed night duties. She did this quietly, shifting a roster in ink where no eye but hers saw. Those small acts of agency mattered because they were rare and because the machinery did not always notice them. The ledger counted nights served, not the subtleties of who arranged which shift. Still, she felt the ledger's shape around her. Even freedom as law could be entangled in social relationships that did not loosen with a seal. To be manumitted in name was often to remain economically and socially enmeshed. Former owners could keep influence. Households expected continued association, and the wider society read a freed woman through a lens shaped by her prior status. Catherine understood these limits. She had learned the phrase conditional manumission, used in other households, where freedom was always tethered to conditions. In the weeks before her audience, she rehearsed not only the words of the petition, but the appearance of composure. Sophia watched, and for a moment she softened, not with pity so much as with a recognition that had nothing to do with the institution. "You have kept the ledger without letting it take your maim," Sophia said once, and for all its smallness, the sentence carried an acknowledgment of persistence that the wax tablets could not record. The day of the audience approached like a slow procession in which every act was annotated: the sealing of a petition, the stamping of a docket, the marking of the date. Catherine's neighborhood smelled of wet stone and frying onions. Inside the household, the copper bowls were polished for visitors. The steward placed her petition into a satchel with other petitions and handed it to a sealman who was to deliver the documents to the Qadi's office. Outside, a messenger would walk through the arcades where merchants argued over bolts of cloth and where the memory of the city's older governance still hummed in the air. The city's history pressed against present procedure, a reminder that institutions reshuffle but keep certain logics intact. When the sealman left, Catherine felt the ledger's weight shift and, briefly, felt an openness that could be called hope. She pressed the mirror to her face and tried to find the woman who had once read a prayer aloud in the market. The woman who looked back had learned the syntax of survival. She breathed in the lamp's smell, tasted the iron of resolve on her tongue, and waited. Outside the doors, the city moved in its usual rhythms. Inside the house, candles burned with a steady wick. The steward returned with a list of names for a household task. "You and Zara will prepare the banquet linens," he said, and in that ordinary command there was the careful balance of continuity, work carried on as if nothing extraordinary were in motion, because the machinery of life did not pause for the slow cogs of law. Catherine set about her work, folding linens with a precision honed by years of practice. Each fold was a line in an unwritten ritual. When the linens were ready, she placed a small wax seal on the packet, a private habit that had started as a joke and hardened into a constant. Later, she would understand how often a human being reduces herself to a token and then imagines the token as proof of personhood. For now, the seal was just a small piece of heated wax that cooled into a ridge, a sign that someone had tended to what mattered enough to press it closed. That night she lay awake and counted not the years but the phrases of her speech, like prayers that held a different promise. She recalled the steward's thumb on the petition, the way the sealman had balanced the satchel on his shoulder. There was a peculiar intimacy in the thought that the fate of her petition rested in such hands, hands that had handled ledgers and bread and dirhams. Institutions are, at their core, human.
Hands making decisions within a system that rationalizes those hands' actions. The cruelty of such systems is often procedural. It claims neutrality as a way to evade moral judgment. Catherine had been shaped to speak in the ledger's language, and when the day of audience came, she wore the garments of someone who knew how to be legible to the law. She walked with Sophia to the hall where petitioners waited. The hall was lined with tapestries that muted sound and upheld the dignity of a room meant for public justice. Rows of benches held people whose lives had been reduced to entries and seals. The Qadi's bench sat raised, a simple platform against which the public performed the ritual of appeal. Seals and tablets lay on a table like tools before their use. When her name was called, the silence of the hall folded over her like a hand. The Qadi's face was impassive as parchment. He took the tablet, brushed the wax with a practiced thumb, and read. The steward submitted a verbal account. Years of service, duties performed, the steward's own testimony that Catherine had instructed novices and had maintained household records. The Qadi's notes were clinical, his role the mechanical translation of law into verdict. The audience watched the Qadi's face for a sign. The silence between the reading and the judgment seemed to form its own pressure. Catherine spoke when it was her turn. She used the legal phrasing she had rehearsed, her voice even as the hall tuned itself to her words. Her petition was unembellished, a listing of service and a request. When she finished, she did what many petitioners did. She lowered her eyes, allowed no plea beyond what the law permitted, and left the rest to the mechanisms she had tried to address with her tablet and seal. The Qadi conferred briefly with a clerk, their whispers specialized and not intended for petitioners' ears. In the back of the hall, a clerk stamped a tablet. The sound, a small metallic kiss, punctuated time. The Qadi's verdict, when it came, would be written into a tablet, sealed and dated, and then an entry would be made in the household's ledger that recorded the movement of status. The public nature of the hearing meant that the legal transformation, should it occur, would be visible on formal paper even if the social ties remained tangled. Catherine left the hall with the steward's hand on her shoulder, not a touch of patronage but of administrative closure. A man took the sealed tablet and walked back toward the steward's office. The machinery would do what it does: record, seal, redistribute. What remained for Catherine was the patient, private reckoning she had practiced in front of the mirror and the unknownness that followed. Outside, the city's arcades glowed with afternoon light. Inside, the household settled into the rhythm of evening tasks. Catherine returned to the mirror in her small room and studied the face that had petitioned the Cadi.
Law. The seal marks that had once produced her submission now lay, potentially, on a document that might release her. Freedom by law and freedom by lived circumstance were not the same thing. She had learned that already. Yet the act of petitioning, of placing a legal claim against the ledger, was itself an assertion that the institution could be addressed in its own language. On her small wax tablet, she recorded the date of the hearing as if to stake the claim in memory. The stroke of her stylus felt like a small victory in itself, an individual asserting the right to be recorded differently. She did not imagine a triumphant escape. She imagined, instead, a life with different constraints. The possibility of renting a room, of riding in a caravan as a free woman, of buying a blue-glazed bowl without the steward's permission. These were modest dreams. They were, nonetheless, hers. When the steward closed the ledger that night, someone else, somewhere in the administrative fold, would be opening it again. The city moved through its procedures with indifferent rhythm. The ledger would absorb the petition as it absorbed everything else: wax, seal, notation, until the moment of official response. Catherine slept with the petition's possibility like a small coin under her pillow. In the weeks that followed, the petition moved along its bureaucratic path, and Catherine continued to fold linens and teach and press seals. Sometimes she would rearrange the roster to spare a young woman from the more exposed nights, and those small acts felt like thinned light in a long tunnel. She knew, from years of living under institutional arithmetic, that the line between survival and complicity is thick with compromises. She also knew that actions small enough to be unregistered by a ledger could nonetheless change a life. The archives that later preserved Catherine's story kept both kinds of evidence: the wax tablets that recorded her petition and the steward's entries that marked her days. They preserved the seal impressions that matched, in careful inked photographs, to the steward's thumb marks. They preserved the handwriting that matched the strokes of her stylus. But the archives cannot fully register the nights when she reshuffled chores to shield another, or the private rehearsals before the mirror. Those acts live in the creases between entries, in the tactility of a folded linen, in the way a woman learns to keep her dignity within a restricted set of moves. The system had its logic: extract, classify, profit, maintain order. It also produced an unexpected output: people who, having been forced into its mechanisms, learned how to bend them in small ways. Catherine's petition would eventually be decided, and the result would be recorded. But the real story, the one that mattered for memory and moral reckoning, was not only whether she received a formal manumission. It was how, within the arithmetic of the ledger, she found room for decision, how she taught and sheltered others, how she remembered a father bargaining at a market stall, how she pressed wax and sometimes changed a roster line. The petition sat in the Cadi's office for a time long enough to test patience. The steward would bring news in a clipped voice, or sometimes not at all. When word arrived that the Cadi had scheduled a formal confirmation, Catherine felt both relief and a new kind of dread. Public law, however favorable, obliges public performance. The day set for the final confirmation was written into the household ledger and sealed. On the morning the confirmation was to be delivered, Catherine dressed in the garments she had been taught to wear in public: plain, well-pressed, unadorned. Sophia fastened the cord at her waist with a practiced hand. "Remember," Sophia said, "you speak the ledger's language and you keep your eyes level. Nothing more is needed." Her voice meant, in softer syllables, that hope should not be exposed to ridicule. Catherine walked to the steward's office, where the household's representative would receive the Cadi's formal response.
The steward broke the seal on a small tablet and read aloud the Cadi's notation. The words were precise. A confirmation, a recording of manumission to be enacted in the steward's ledger following the Cadi's procedure and after the appropriate seals were affixed. There was no theatrical flourish, only the crisp turning of pages and the steady stamping of a seal. A man in the office stamped the tablet and slid it across the desk. The steward read the lines again and then looked up at Catherine with a complexity that had little to do with the institution and more to do with two people who had navigated the same machinery. "You are recorded as manumitted," he said. The sentence carried the weight of administrative resolve. It was an official alteration in her status. Catherine's breath hitched, not with a triumph that would break into song, but with a quiet intake that acknowledged a legal change. The seal on the tablet made the transformation public in the way law makes things public. The record existed now, and that record carried a formal legitimacy. Yet even as her name was uncoupled from certain entries, she understood the tether she would still bear. The household would not instantly release the patterns of dependence that years had woven into the social fabric. Manumission would not undo memory, nor would it erase the nights recorded elsewhere under other categories. She pressed her palm to the cooling wax on the tablet, as if to feel the impression of the seal with her skin. The mark was simple, a stamp that declared the law's assent. The wax was both an ending and a beginning, with the same material used to seal both ownership and release. The ledger had changed the category listed beside her name, but the social arithmetic would continue to calculate debts and favors, obligations and expectations. When she left the steward's office, she held the small tablet in a folded cloth. The sun struck the city's arcades in a way that turned stone into gold for a moment. People moved through the market without any visible shift in response to the legal change in one household. For most of the city, there is continuity in the ordinary hours. For Catherine, however, the change was profound in a narrow sense. Legally, she was free. What the law had not required, and what the records could not display, was the slow interior repair of someone who had been forced repeatedly into erasures. Freedom as a status is not the same as freedom as an experience. Catherine understood that freedom would arrive with conditions: the expectation that she might continue to live within the household's orbit, the possibility that economic ties would pull her back, the social suspicion that clung to women who had passed through such institutions. She also knew that the legal declaration had given her an instrument to negotiate the world in a different voice. That evening, she did something small and crucial. She walked to the market and bought a blue-glazed bowl with a dirham she had saved in the seam of her mattress. When she held the bowl in her hands, it felt like a proof that she could hold something owned by herself. The bowl was not a grand sign of victory, it was a modest artifact of autonomy. She took it home, cleaned it, and placed it atop her small chest where the mirror rested. The bowl reflected the lamp's light in a way that the mirror never had. The glaze held a patch of reflected flame like an ember. Her manumission entered the archives as an entry with a seal. Scholars who later examined the collection would tally dates and seals and measure the frequency with which petitions succeeded. They would note that manumission after extended service existed as a legal mechanism and that it had logistical and moral complications. They would cite the tablet that bore Catherine's name and note, in a footnote, that she continued to work within the household for some time after her manumission. The archives would preserve the official facts: dates, names, seals. They would not, by themselves, render the texture of the nights or the small acts of shelter she had provided to younger women. Catherine would continue to negotiate the contours of her freedom, drafting a new ledger in memory that counted not only days, but small acts of agency: the lining of a girl's robe to make it warmer, the secret substitution of a night shift, the saving of a dirham. In public, she would carry the legal status of a free woman. In private, she would carry the ledger of memory and the knowledge that institutions leave marks that law does not always erase. The household steward, in the late winter of the year recorded as near the end of Calloway's rise, would close a ledger and push it into a shelf. The wax tablet of Catherine's manumission would slide into a compartment with hundreds of others,
some of liberation, some of mundane transfers, some of condemnation. The shelf's dust would settle, and the seal impressions would harden into permanent shape. For Catherine, the legal recognition mattered because it created an opening, however narrow, in a system that had been designed to enclose. She placed the blue-glazed bowl beside the mirror and for a long moment watched the flame in its glaze. The city's noise filtered through the walls like a distant counting. In the reflection, she did not find the old market girl intact. She found a woman who had learned to speak the ledger's language, and who, in learning it, had also learned how to press a small dent into the machine that sought to classify her. It was a modest dent, recorded in wax and in memory. It was not a salvation. It was nonetheless a change. What the archives would show later was a set of dates and seals and a modest legal change. What the living would remember, if they chose to remember, might be the bowl on the chest, the secret rearrangements of rosters, Sophia's silent watching, and the way a woman learned to protect another in a system that measured human life with harsh arithmetic. There is in that testimony a lesson about institutional cruelty and about the fragile acts that resist it. Not dramatic revolts so much as quiet refusals. The choice to protect one more girl. The decision to keep one more record in a private tablet. Catherine slept that night with the image of the bowl bright in her mind. Freedom, as she now knew, was a layered thing. Legal status, social negotiation, inner repair. The ledger could be amended. The social ledger required different work. She had changed an entry in the book of law. She had not erased the ledger's other columns. She had nonetheless shifted the arithmetic just enough to purchase the smallest of dignities. Beyond the household, the city continued to turn on its formalities. The Mamluk machines of administration kept their rhythms. Capture and classification in other regions. Training in formal weeks. Ledgers sealed and preserved. The system that had sent Catherine into the hands of those who count would continue to operate, and many would pass through its procedures without their names returning to the light. Her story would be, therefore, representative and particular, one human life threaded through institutional practice, one wax tablet among many. Catherine rose the morning after her manumission and began, as she always had, the work of small economies, counting linens, teaching a novice how to fold, placing a dirham in the seam of a mattress. She had her bowl and her law. She had also the knowledge that the ledger's logic persisted in quieter places. What she could do, having changed one column, was to use whatever agency she possessed to alter the margins, to shield, to teach, to write small tablets that preserved names. The archives would later show an entry of her manumission. Her living would be a ledger of deeds that no official seal could wholly capture. In the months to come, she would take additional measures to secure the independence her legal status afforded, arranging a small trade, speaking to merchants she trusted, and saving a modest fund of dirhams. She would visit the market at dawn to buy oil and spices, learning again how the city's ordinary commerce could be a lifeline for an individual freed in law but still bound by social constraints. Each small purchase was a practice in autonomy, an assertion that the world might be navigated on terms not solely determined by household's demands. Yet the most important work she did after manumission was not to widen her own circle, but to protect a handful of younger women who remained in positions the ledger recorded as assigned. She could not liberate all of them. Few could claim the legal instruments she had acquired, but she could create moments in which the ledger's arithmetic miscounted. She taught the novices the way she had been taught, to fold a robe tightly enough to remain secure, to read a wax tablet by lamplight, to press a seal without hesitation. She taught them, too, the small gestures of solidarity that the system could not easily tabulate, passing on a few dirhams, shifting a roster, speaking a kind phrase at the right moment when a trainer's gaze might otherwise harden. These acts accumulated like small deposits. They were not loud, they did not overturn the system. Yet within institutions built of procedures, small errors of calculation can create spaces of breathing. For Catherine, memory and law became two ledgers in which she kept the names of those she sheltered. She would later write their names on a private tablet kept folded and hidden in a chest. The tablet would survive in fragments, found by archival hands who could not reconstruct every small act, but could measure that someone had tried. The household, for its part, adjusted without fanfare. Legal manumissions were not unprecedented. They were a mechanism the system used to clear certain liabilities while maintaining its structure. Catherine's status changed the steward's field notes by a line. The household's daily life continued. Callowin's influence waxed and waned with the politics of the city, and the steward's ledgers continued to record food, oil, and the quiet calculus of human labor. On an evening some seasons later, Catherine sat with Sophia in the courtyard where figs had once been piled in a market memory. They spoke of small things: the way a wax tablet resists an imprinted seal if not warmed enough, the proper way to fold linen to prevent wrinkles. Once, in the half-light, Sophia said, "You have kept your name in the place where many lose theirs." The sentence, simple, practical, was a recognition that carried more weight than any juridical seal. It named what law could not measure, the manner of living a life of care in the margins of a system designed to flatten difference. Catherine touched the glaze of her bowl with a finger. "It does not undo what was taken," she replied, "but it lets me make small things different." The bowl, clean and blue, reflected a shard of the sky. Institutional cruelty had been part of her life, its arithmetic drafted into the records. So had been her quiet refusals. The ledger could record one and not the other. Memory would try to hold both. The archives would keep the wax tablets, the seals, the steward's entries. Historians would read those tablets and construct narratives about systems and mechanics. Readers would learn, from the official entries, that manumission existed as a legal pathway. But Catherine's story is not merely a footnote in administration. It is testimony to the ways ordinary human decisions, made in the interstices of procedure, resist the singular narrative of system efficiency. Her bowl and the private tablet of names were small resistances, reminders that within the arithmetic of cruelty there is room, however narrow, for different counts. The city continued its accounting. Men stamped tablets. Seals hardened. New arrivals moved through the 3 doors and into training weeks numbered and practiced. The system that had made Catherine's life both constrained and possible persisted in its logic. And yet, in the small ledger she kept, the margin where she wrote names by hand, Catherine recorded another kind of arithmetic: the number of nights she had saved, the number of girls she had taught to press a seal, the dates she had preserved in wax. She wrote to remember that even within bureaucratic calculation there is a ground for human action. When later readers find Catherine's wax tablet in an archival box among other tablets, they will read the official language and see that the Cadi confirmed the manumission. They will see the seal and the steward's signature. If they are attentive, they will also notice the small private tablet folded within a chest, scratched, uneven handwriting that lists names and small acts. Zara, spare night. Amina, linen mended. Petition, filed. Bowl, purchased. The private tablet is not a legal instrument. It is rather a memorial of the ways one person can carve out breathing space inside a system that counts human lives with cold numeracy. Catherine never claimed to have defeated the system. She understood its endurance. She also understood that a life measured in law differs from a life lived in memory. Her manumission, recorded in wax, was one kind of outcome. The lives she altered quietly were another. Both matter, for the history she left behind. One shows how institutions operate. The other shows how individuals, even within such institutions, enact small resistances that keep human dignity alive. The ledger in the steward's office recorded her new status. The private tablet recorded the debts of solidarity. Both ledgers, when read together, produce a fuller image, a record of institutional procedure and a record of the human responses that sought to make those procedures less absolute. It is, perhaps, the only adequate way to remember. Women like Catherine, by honoring both the archival record and the quieter inscriptions of care, the city moved on. New names appeared on wax tablets, 3 doors kept opening and closing. In a chest, under a cloth, the blue-glazed bowl caught and held a flame. In the margin of a private tablet, someone had written a short list of names that might otherwise have been lost to the official ledger. That list is Catherine's true testament, a small human arithmetic that refused to let the system number every aspect of life alone.